This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hi, I'm Li Xueying, and you're listening to Asian Insider. In this episode, ST's China Bureau Chief Tan Dawn Wei talks about those who protect the Great Wall of China and how they reflect the country's changing attitudes towards heritage restoration. Hello, Dawn. It's good to have you on the show.
Hi, Xueying. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So, Dawn, you wrote about the three men who made it their life's mission to protect the Great Wall of China. I mean, one usually thinks of the Great Wall protecting China. One doesn't think of the Great Wall being in need of protection. Can you tell us a bit more about why you thought it was important to document their story?
Yeah, I thought this story would resonate with our readers because you have three men, two of them, well into their 60s and one in his 80s, who have devoted much of their lives trying to salvage, safeguard, preserve, and also importantly extend the legacy of one of China's most important and definitely most famous artifact and a symbol of its long and tumultuous history. And these three men who are retired, they are still doing it, although they have also since trained and handed the reins over to the next generation of Great Wall Guardians. And this is such a ground-up story because none of this is directed from the top down by the government. These men did what they did because they understood the importance of preserving and passing on their civilization's legacy. And the job of restoring and documenting and studying the Great Wall will never end because the wall will continue to erode with time and it will continually have to be restored, the entire 21,000 kilometers of it. So I just thought that their stories would make an inspirational read.
So what does it mean when we say that they are protecting the Great Wall? And how has that changed over the years? So as you noted, this is one of China's most famous artifact. And China's way of restoring this 2,000-year-old wonder has evolved as well over the years. How has that changed over time?
Yeah, well, at the beginning, when China was deeply impoverished, obviously the priority was really to feed people's mouths, right? And so historical heritage preservation, that was not something that was top on people's minds, not the government and certainly not the people, who were kind of struggling to make ends meet. So it was only later on, when the country has progressed sufficiently enough that I think these considerations came into the picture.
And how has that changed in terms of how they went about it? So I think that as you wrote, there were several sections that were extensively renovated from the 1950s, and they were in fact turned into tourist attractions with cable cars and all, but today the focus is more on authenticity.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the men that you spoke to, Chen Yongmao, said his mantra when restoring is to go with the flow. So I was wondering if you could first take us through how the Chinese government's mindset about restoration has shifted over time.
Yeah, I think there was some kind of a plan, quite a few years ago, sort of more of an overall plan to be more systematic and to be more consistent with the restoration of the entire Great Wall, because the management of the Great Wall actually falls under local jurisdiction. So local governments take charge of what to do with the walls, including its upkeep. And I think in some places there was probably less consciousness of heritage preservation. The priority was really to make sure that the wall isn't going to be a safety hazard, right? So I think in the case, there was a case in 2016 in Liaoning where netizens posted some pictures of a stretch of the wall which was paved over with cement. And then I think that kind of caused a little bit
sacrilegious, right?
uproar. And I think the local authorities acknowledged that maybe they could have done better in that case, but then in their defense, they said that the wall was at risk of crumbling. And so they had to, do a quick fix. And that was basically to use cement to fortify it. But then now that there is an overall plan as to how to preserve the wall, and I think officials in the past have also acknowledged that certain sections may have been overly restored. They have, beautified it too much. So now I think the mantra is just to go with the flow. And they have a slogan to go with it because, in China, they love their slogans. So it's
Yes.
随城随坡随湾随旧随禅, which is to translate into English, to go along with the layers, the slopes, the curves, the old and the dilapidated. So in essence, it is just to maintain the structure using materials as close as possible to the original and nothing more.
Right. And what accounts for this change in how they went about doing it? And what does it also say about the broader mindset in China today about heritage restoration and preservation?
Yeah, I think this is the kind of thing that comes naturally with progress, right? Including economic progress. And as I said before, when China was deeply impoverished and had just come out of the Civil War, certainly heritage preservation was not something that was on the top of their priority list. But of course, as the country became richer, the political system became more stable and society became more mature. There was then space to consider other things like heritage preservation. And of course, they were developing their tourism industry as well. So putting the Great Wall back, picking up the pieces, putting it back into place was something they had to do too, right, to try and boost the tourism industry.
Right. And turning back to the three men that you spoke to, what struck you most about your interactions with them? You did spend quite some time with each of them, and they are actually very different. One is Mr. Cheng, who goes about restoring the wall, as you said. The other one patrols the walls to make sure that no one pilfers anything from it. And the third is an academic who maps and chronicles the stretches of the wall. So can you tell me a bit more about them?
I think the one thing that unites the three stories, or the three of them, even though, they come from different angles in terms of being a Great Wall guardian, I think that the one thing that brings them together is just this understanding that they need to, or they want to, pass on this legacy to the next generation and the generations beyond. And they are just doing a small part in this process, which will keep going on and on and on for generations to come.
And do you get the sense that the younger Chinese are similarly emotionally invested in this?
I think so. I think it's because of their efforts that they have managed to influence and inspire the people around them to take on this job as well. So it is really the people around them that are now sort of taken over this mantle and carrying on the work that they have started.
Well, going beyond the immediate circles of these three men, what is the position that the Great Wall holds among the younger Chinese today? Is it something that they think about or care about deeply, or is it something that looms just in the distance? Because coming from the outside world, of course, we think of the Great Wall as something that is so magnificent. But what does it mean for the ordinary Chinese, especially the younger ones?
Yeah, I don't really think that it is very much in their consciousness. And it was something that was quite surprising because when I spoke to Professor Zhang and his team, and they do a lot of field work, right? They bring out these teams of PhD and master students at Tianjin University to go out into the field to document and map, the entire stretch of the wall. So it's 3D mapping. They put out drones to capture images. And they were telling me that of these PhD and master students that they've recruited who are studying architecture, majority of them have never actually been up the Great Wall.
Oh.
Yeah, until now, until they've signed up.
Yes. Yes, for
this course of study.
And they had to
then
go.
they've been sent out, right,
Yes.
by Professor Zhang.
Right.
So I thought that was quite interesting because for me, coming into China as an outsider, the first things that I had wanted to do 6 years ago was actually to go up the Great Wall.
Yes.
So I feel it is interesting to me that young people, perhaps, it's something that's always there. They will always be there in their backyard. And so there's no real sort of urgency or push for them to see it. And in the case of one of the men that I spoke to, Mr. Cheng, he says even though he lived just by the Great Wall, he had not climbed it until He was at the age of 45 when he was sent up there to restore it because the Summer Olympics, the 2008 Summer Olympics was coming.
Wow. So I guess it does speak to how it is really part of the background for them. It's part of the landscape for the Chinese.
Yes.
Not to have to think about it in a way that we outsiders do. So Dawn, you mentioned that when you got to China 6 years ago, one of the first things you wanted to do was to climb the Great Wall. So tell me about that. How much of the Great Wall have you ventured to?
Well, I have been fortunate to have seen a good number of sections of the wall as I am based in Beijing.
Yes.
And a lot of the Ming Wall is accessible within 2 or 3 hour drive. The majority of tourists who come to Beijing, they will go to the ticketed and most restored sections in Badaling and Mutianyu. And those are very well preserved, overly preserved, if you ask me. They come with cable cars and they come with toboggan rides. But it is the unrestored wild walls, which are away from the crowds, where you really can just get a sense of just how magnificent this structure is. And you can just, soak in the scale of the wall, and you can, trace it over the valleys and over the mountains as far as the eye can see. And it is just truly an incredible, humbling experience. But in recent years, the government has made it quite hard for people to climb the wild wall, as there have been incidents of people falling to their deaths. And some of these sections are actually pretty treacherous because a lot of the wall has already crumbled away. But that has not stopped adventurous thrill seekers from climbing it.
Yes.
And it would be impossible to police, the entire stretch of the wall.
So just as they were meant to keep the invaders out, but they can't quite keep those who want to visit from within to go and find it.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Dawn, for joining us on the show, and thank you for sharing your experiences.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's a wrap for Asian Insider. If you would like to read our column, we have a link in our podcast show notes. This episode was produced and edited by Faisal Sani. Thank you for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.